Okay then, I think we're good. Apparently I'm cat in the chat as I talk, other than that. Right, okay then. Okay then, I think we're good. Apparently I'm cat in the chat as I talk, other than that. Right, okay then. Welcome to LGBT Comic Book History Month. My name's Matt. This is my first time public speaking in front of a large group of people, so if at any point it looks like I'm having a panic attack, there's a very good reason for that. So, today we're just going to essentially be looking into LGBT representation within comic books over the last 100 years or so. What does that mean? Basically means we're going to be looking at the characters, we're going to be looking at the creators behind those characters who were represented by it, and we're going to look at the overall trends. We're going to be seeing a mishmash of different histories that have occurred. We're going to be looking at various time periods. We're going to be starting off with the early time periods of essentially the early 1900s to 1954. I've chosen 1954 very specifically here, we'll see why. Then we've got like the chunk, which is essentially the 1954 chunk to around 1990, and then we'll be going into the new millennium and we'll be seeing that there. Just generally seeing how things have shifted in time. Along the way, we'll be getting nice pictures in the background of little comics drawn by various LGBT comic book artists, as well as comics from the more mainstream comics. So, a few quick things before we start. Most of my focus will be on the American side of things. That's where a lot of comic book history has mostly happened. There are fascinating things on the British side of things, on the European side of things, on the Japanese side of things. I just don't have time to cover it all, unfortunately. My first attempt at recording this ended up at like an hour and a half, so I've had to cut a lot of content, unfortunately. So, along the way, we'll be seeing a bit of insensitive imagery going on, usually like bad depictions, not as much of it as I thought there would be, but at the same time, there'll be a lot of dumb historical decisions of people thinking they were doing what was best, but not so much. There may also see some bad interpretations, as well as changing terminology, such as the use of the term transsexual rather than transgender, which was occurring in the 1900s. I'll also slip up plenty of my words. I may say like queer or gay when I'm referring to LGBTQIA and the like. So just bear with me when that happens. Hopefully it should be very obvious by context. If you've got any questions or you want to know something about a particular character that you're familiar with, dump it in the chat box or we'll ask questions at the end. And with that, we'll get started. Right, so a few years back, I did Black Comic Book History Month, and I basically covered very similar things there, like the history of like Black characters within comic books. When I did that, one of the early things that I noticed was essentially a lot of oppression. You can imagine very derogatory images, very like bad representations, very cringeworthy like drawings of Black people in that. So generally you found it was a lot of oppression. On the flip side, in the LGBT space, it's more suppression. You'll often find a lot of it isn't there. I had to kind of really like plumb the depths of history in order to find a lot of examples here and to kind of like build it up. And over time, we see that suppression essentially being overcome, and we'll see how the different ways as we go through the lecture. Okay, so first off, we'll start with everyone's favorite subject, retail distribution laws within the United States of America in the 1800s. So we essentially start off in an era of what we call the Comstock era. So Comstock was a man who saw himself as a decent fellow of very traditional values. As you can imagine, that meant he kind of looked down on anything that would be considered indecent. This was a time when homosexuality would have been considered a mental disorder. People were getting locked up for it. People were actually being like ferried away to be looked at by psychiatrists to see if it could be cured. And Comstock saw that era and was kind of like working off it. So he initially started off what's known as the Comstock obscenity laws. These were basically, initially these started off essentially in ways we could possibly all agree with. It was things like preventing pornography from being sent through the post, preventing lotteries from being sent through the post. Just generally like setting it up so like places of distribution, so magazine corner stores and the like, could essentially have it so that, you know, they didn't essentially do anything that nobody really wanted. Over time, though, addendums got added to those laws in order to essentially like downplay certain things. So this would be initially like things like erotica and the like, preventing pornography from being easily distributed. This would be what like pornography on the top shelves. Along the same lines, though, concepts such as homosexuality or transsexualism were essentially buried. They were like pushed away. Distributors at the time saw it if we move on to the next one, distribution. Yeah. So this was essentially an era of self-censorship. Most of what was essentially comic books and comic strips were handled by these distributors, and their focus was on a business. They wanted to sell as many copies as their stock as possible to as many people as possible. And this led to a focus more on traditional values of essentially non-LGBT focus. So anything that was essentially like that tended to be pushed away. This is where we get a lot of the common ones. So the Mickey Mouse comics, the Popeye comics, everything was more focused on the American way and being as normal as possible. And as such, things such as LGBT concepts, queer traits and the likes, they tended not to show up as much. If they did show up, it was generally buried. And we'll be looking at a lot of this as we go along to this initial section. So let's start off with a very good example. So Wonder Woman is probably one of the more popular characters everybody knows of. She's considered the Trinity of DC Comics alongside Batman and Superman. So Wonder Woman was, to a lot of people, Wonder Woman often isn't a lot of people's first choice when they think of a queer character, although that's changing to some extent nowadays. When she was created by a man called William Marston, and in association with both his wife and their polyamorous life partner. So William had a pretty queer relationship going for himself. It was essentially in a three-way relationship. This was essentially buried over time, but a lot of his early depictions of Wonder Woman would show certain implicitly queer elements. I'm going to be using the word implicitly a lot here. We'll be doing a lot of work in this early section. So Wonder Woman basically came from the island of Themyscira. I've not actually said that word out loud, apparently. She was brought to life by a woman, but no man was involved, and she lived on an island full of Amazon women, all of whom had no real connections with men. Her storyline would essentially, her main romance would actually be her leaving the island and meeting a man called Steve Trevor and having a relationship with him over time. This, although to some extent it's a bit of a stretch, this is essentially like a bisexual relationship sort of happening. We have a woman here who was basically on an island full of women, had a male partner, and again, it sort of gets put under the radar to some extent, but it kind of is there. Another early example is Sanjak, somebody who's tended to be known as the first lesbian character in comics. She was introduced in a comic strip in the 1930s called Terry and the Pirates. She only has a small section within it. She's basically considered one of many villains that are after the Baron's gold. So she's never explicitly stated to be a lesbian character, but she has a lot of the traits that at the time would have been considered lesbian characteristics. She dresses like a male. She has short hair. She has a monocle. The monocle thing is a really interesting one. I've not actually been able to find examples of a monocle being a lesbian stereotype post-1930s, but at the time, it was considered a really obvious thing, as well as her outrageous French accent, as we can see her. Her storyline in this is mostly taking the love interest of the main character, Terry, at the time, and trying to convince her to join her in what very much looks like a case of one woman hitting on another woman and essentially trying to woo her to her side. So Sanjak is killed within the storyline, and she's just essentially disappears from that point on. She does apparently come back, but I was never actually able to find any examples. So we see, this is essentially probably the earliest example of somebody who's essentially a lesbian, but again, the word implicit is doing the work here. Comics in general and during this era essentially invited a lot of these implicit queer tropes. If you think of stories involving aliens, stories involving shapeshifters, stories involving androids, these would be stories where essentially you would have shapeshifters switching between male and female forms in order to trick people. You would have androids and aliens coming along not understanding what love is and wanting the humans to show them, showing kind of hints of asexual traits. We have here possibly the earliest example of an implicit transgender character. The Ultra Humanite was your standard mad scientist type character who essentially transplanted his brain across multiple bodies. At one point, transplanting it through into one of the main hero's love interests and essentially turning himself into a female character. Shapeshifting characters would assume these forms of hesitation. We also have Ming the Merciless here. You may remember him from the Flash Gordon TV shows of the past. So in the comics, he shows zero interest in anything romantic, although he's known in the TV series as usually kidnapping the woman and trying to get her to marry him. In the comics, he shows no interest like this, and that was a common trope of a lot of alien characters at the time. Moving on, we'll actually get into what's probably considered one of the first LGBT creators of the era. So Marston in the past is kind of known to be a potential one, although he himself was essentially heterosexual with two females who were bisexual. It gets a bit complicated. Matt Baker is generally accepted to be the first gay comic book hero in the comics industry. At the time, it was not known. He came onto the scene. He was a fantastic artist. He drew like good girl comics. Good girl comics are kind of an old trope of like the old romantic comedy type comics of like the era. So Canteen Kate is a good one, where it's basically just essentially girls having fun would be the logic. But he was the artist for these types. He created the character of Phantom Lady. If you're into the DC sphere at all, you will sort of know who this character is. She's kind of considered an old character nowadays, doesn't get brought up much. Matt Baker never revealed his homosexuality in a public sphere during the time he was alive. He died very early at the age of 37. And afterwards, it would come out from friends in like journal articles and interviews and the like that he was gay. He kept this quiet during his entire time, but nowadays he's kind of essentially been considered the first gay comic book artist of his era. Right. Moving on. During the time of earlier on, I stated like 1954 would be a kind of cutoff date before changes would occur, and I just managed to sneak this one in 1953. So this is the first explicit, probably the first explicit LGBT character whatsoever, and I have to really plumb the depths to find this one. Space Adventures is, as you can guess, just a series of short sci-fi comics that came up with containing short stories. And we have the character of Dr. Cranston. Dr. Cranston, fed up with humanity tending to cause war and wanting to start an age of reason, basically got himself and a bunch of other scientists onto a rocket ship. They went off to Mars, the rocket crashed, it killed everybody bar him, and unbeknownst to him, his girlfriend Betty, who got separated from the crash somehow. Basically all alone and kind of trying to keep himself entertained in various ways, he opts to take hormone replacement therapy, essentially transforming himself, a transformation of sex, as he phrased it, making himself into making himself into a female. There's an interesting little moment here where he basically says he's tired of being a man, and he doesn't he views being a man as generally a bad idea, and so he turns himself into a woman, only to find his girlfriend Betty show up at the end. It's a sort of awkward, clunky storyline for this. It's clearly just designed, it's sort of designed to be a bit of a punchline at the end of the story. It shows, after turning himself into a woman, his girlfriend Betty shows up to discover this, and there's this implication that here they are, trapped on Mars, no longer like Adam and Eve, but more just Eve and Eve. And it's a very awkward, early, clunky storyline, but that's essentially what we've got in this era. So at this point, we kind of get an idea of what the pre-1950s were in terms of LGBT representation. It's what I call like an era of traits, implicit references, suggestions, all up to reader interpretation. Usually, if anything's intended, it's often buried. For example, in Willie Marston's case with Wonder Woman, after he stopped writing on the comic, all of his stuff was buried. It was all completely, it was changed as much as possible. It would have been brought up so that a case of although that you have still had the island of Amazon women, there was very little focus on it, or there was no romantic context. He had a tendency of doing a lot of bondage comics a lot of bondage imagery at the time of Wonder Woman. All of that just disappeared, and anything queer or non-heteronormative was essentially removed from it. So, but it was there, and this isn't even going into the usual bombardment of superheroes in general, men wearing their underwear on their front, being a little too close with their fellow man, female superheroes not ditching their dates in order to go beat up bank robbers. It was all there, and just kind of no one admitting to it. But unfortunately, there were people beginning to notice, and they weren't quite liking what was going on. And one of those people was Dr. Frederick Wertham in 1954. Dr. Frederick Wertham saw what was happening in the comic book industry and kind of staring at it a little bit hurt and going, I don't like that. And so he released his book on the subject called Seduction of the Innocent, which this didn't just cover LGBT issues. This covered things like extreme violence in comic books, horror, gore, essentially as you probably know with a lot of superhero comics, the female form tends to be heavily exaggerated, and people were looking at that and sort of shaking their heads. He took it many, many, many steps too far and started pointing out a lot of things he kind of pushed for things that he was seeing but were kind of subject to interpretation. Probably the clearest one would be Batman and Robin. Now, Batman and Robin, in case you're not familiar with the secret identities of them, Robin was Dick Grayson. He was essentially Batman's adopted son, and as such, they would share essentially father-son playful relationships. So, like as seen in the image here of them in bed, like together, he would look at that and see a homosexual gay relationship, and not like what he was seeing. And the book's a fun little read to read, like essentially like 70 years later, but you would sort of see like problems with it. He has a chapter called "I Want to Be a Sex Maniac," where he would discuss in depth. He would essentially like show interviews of young men at show like them saying how like they would read these stories and it would make them gay just by reading the stories, and he would like over exaggerate this and like often like bringing up like false representations, just basically like over exaggerating it to like best he can. The idea that maybe like the people reading these comics were gay beforehand and this just merely helped them discover themselves was not even considered. It was just, I read comic book, I become gay, and it was that kind of stupidity. So unfortunately, a lot of people would listen to him. In a particular murder case, that was a issue of a comic was found at the scene of a crime, that a particular horror comic, and this was used to push on the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency in order to push for like comic book regulation. The comic book industry saw what was happening, and there had been talks within it at the time. They had been seeing what was happening in Hollywood with the Hays Code and the possible removal of like certain themes that they would consider indecent, and they would attempt to like replicate this themselves. And first came the Comics Code Authority. So this was a self-imposed set of rules, essentially set by the Comic Magazine Association of America in order to essentially regulate themselves. Again, going back to the distributors of before, they were concerned with losing sales. They didn't really care what was shown them in the comics as long as it sold to the most amount of people whilst receiving the least amount of complaints. And complaints at the time were going towards there being potential like depictions of gay characters, and just unfortunately, that's how it was. So the Comics Code Authority was set in place, and the idea would be that anybody who wanted their comic to be distributed by the mainline channels would have to have it stamped with their authority. So this had plenty of problems, even outside the LGBT space. So one of the earliest examples would be the comic of Judgment Day, which starred a black astronaut character. The mere inclusion of a black astronaut character and the idea that a black man would have been able to go to space was like stamped out by the Comics Code Authority, and the comic was denied. Marv Wolfman, one of the kind of like known as one of the biggest comic book like writers of all time, had a storyline called The Tales of Wolfman. Wolfman, being a horror-themed character like a werewolf, was also refused just because it included his surname. Even Stan Lee would have issues. He would, in coordination with the mayor of New York, want to write a story about drug use that was occurring in Harlem at the time. And so he made a Spider-Man story that focused on this. This got stamped out, and that became one of the first comics to be released without the Comics Code Authority getting its approval. This was kind of like the big problem that was happening here. How did this affect LGBT representation? This is the bit of the Comic Code Authority that actually matters here, and we can have a quick read of it. It's basically saying like divorce cannot be shown as bad. There should be no illicit sexual relationships. There should be respect for parents and the moral code with a sympathetic a view of love and romance. Seduction and rape should never be shown as suggested. These are all things that we can all probably generally agree with. What's missing here is anything to do with words like homosexuality, transsexualism, or the like. So how did this affect LGBT representation? Well, simply enough, it was whoever was in the office of the Comics Code Authority of that day. Basically, comics would come in, they would look at them, they would stamp them, and essentially, you can imagine this being like a small committee of people who would talk themselves out of it. Anything that was even slightly queer would essentially be eliminated. No examples exist, unfortunately, at this time, because essentially the Comics Code Authority did a very good job of itself at the time, unfortunately. But fortunately, obviously, LGBT traits and like characters and creators still kind of existed. It's just they went underground. So this is where we get to the era of the underground. At this point, we're about in the 1950s, 1960s, and things are essentially being buried, but we go to the underground scene. So the underground scene is literally people with photocopiers, people willing to draw like multiple pages several times again and again. Any way they could distribute them, there would literally be men with prams going around local gay bars in New York in order to distribute these comics, and that was the way they were getting them out. So here we come up to the underground scene. Now, this was an era of hypersexualization within the LGBT space. This was very much the era of Not exactly, well, although gay pornography was a part of it, it would also be essentially pin-ups. We would be seeing crude, hypermasculine, like, pictures and the like, and possibly one of the famous artists of the gay community at the time, Toko Lawson. So considered generally one of the most influential creators. He's known as Tom in Finland in the West, but in his like homeland of Finland, Toko Lawson. So he very much started an aesthetic of the hypermasculine gay subculture at the time. So this stuff would essentially be created in Finland, where the laws are much less lax on these types of things, and it would eventually find its way across to more Europe, to like more Western shores in America and England. So Toko is very much known for the blue-collar hypermasculine depiction. So if you think of like the YMCA men, like the dock workers, the construction workers, the police uniforms, and the like, one of his most famous characters here is the character of Kate, very much a would cause most people to blush type image going on. This would be essentially a lot of his work, and it would have a profound impact. He very much liked a man in uniform and would like to show that off in very suggestive ways. Around this time, we also get okay, I slipped my slides around a little bit and missed a bit. So just to explain, this is very much another way of understanding the underground scene at the time is the comics era, comics with an X. So we started to see this is where we started to see these comics here. We had Zack Comics, Spider Bunnies, Mad Magazine. You're probably sort of familiar with the names of these from long ago. This would essentially be the crude jokes, the humor, the casual drug use, casual sex jokes. These comics would have like essentially like homosexual derogatory terms being used in them all the time just as jokes. But they created an opportunity for people in the scene to essentially start distributing their own comics in a similar light. So one of the earliest ones would be women's comics, which would essentially depict like lesbian like comics. The first one of which would have been the comic Sandy Comes Out, created by Trisha Robinson. This is essentially the first true LGBT comic that I can find. So when I say that, I basically mean it's not depicted in like a pin-up manner of essentially like pornography or hypersexualization. It's not depicted in a derogatory manner. It is essentially a story about a lesbian character going about her life and understanding herself as a person. So Sandy Comes Out was created by Trina Robbins, and basically taken from her lesbian sister, and the storyline like just basically is her coming to understand herself as a lesbian. This was essentially received positively at the time, although there were some people. Roberta Gregory was a lesbian who saw that the first lesbian comic strip had been created by a straight woman, didn't like that, and so quickly created her own comic to get it out there less than a year later. So Dynamite Damsels in response. So, and from here we started to see within the underground scene a large flow of these comics coming out. So the most prominent of which would have been, I've lost my previous slide, gay comics. Yes, so gay comics is essentially considered the comic of the underground scene that would essentially keep the gay movement going in comic. A lot of early LGBT creators would get their start in this one. So people like Howard Cruz and the like would essentially get them. So these would be, there would still be some very suggestive themes, as we can kind of see here, the front cover showing the man, as we can see him here. But at the same time, we would see more slice of life storylines. We would see the awkward logistics of being gay in an era where you very much had to hide it as much as possible. So a lot of the early stories here, we see this little story in the bottom right here, is the story of a young man navigating the back rooms of New York. The back rooms being an era where people would essentially go into porn shops and there would be like hookups for gay men, where there was a whole essentially like set of rules in like effect there. You pay an admission, you would wait around in the back rooms. You would sort of meet somebody, go into those back rooms to make out and do other things. Afterwards, you would leave. There would be a gumball to eat in order to help get rid of any like smells that would have occurred along the way, and then you would leave. And these stories would like depict though that. They would also over time depict like the issues that were occurring during the AIDS pandemic, which we will get into a bit more. So let's take a moment to talk about some of the creators. We've got Howard Cruz here. Howard Cruz was the founding editor of Gay Comic. Howard would initially get his start in regular comics, so he wrote the comic Barefoot, which was just essentially a standard slice of life comedy comic, just with his like looks and characters. He would eventually include a gay character in this, but that would be many, many years later. So Howard was sort of like openly known to be gay amongst like the comics like editing community. But at the same time, it was one of those things where it was sort of known but kept secret at the same time. And so as such, when Dennis Ritchie, the creator of the gay comic, started to see a potential niche market here, he picked up Harold and got him to help along with it. So he was more than happy to be the lead editor. He quit the current comic he was working on in order to do this. He would help edit a lot of the early gay comics that would occur. But then he would also go into creating his own comics. The first one of which would have been Wendell. A lot of Howard's comics were semi-autobiographical, so they would cover him growing up gay in the American South and the problems that were occurring then during the 1950s era. So coming to realize he was a gay man, essentially having a boyfriend, having an interracial relationship along the ways, and all the problems that would be involved in that, and meeting up in groups, finding parties to actually go to where you would be safe in those areas. The gay bashing that would unfortunately occur during those times. Howard would generally depict a lot of this. He only died about 10 years ago, so it was kind of he was kind of happy to get to the modern day era where we were seeing better representation in comics. So, but unfortunately, he passed before he could do any future work. Although his best work would be Stick Rubber Baby, which is a full semi-autobiographical account of his life during this time. Another creator that you may be familiar with, Alison Bechdel. You may know her from the Bechdel test that you've probably seen talked about a long time ago in conversations with women in movies and the like. So Alison got her start in the pages of gay comics with the series Dykes to Watch Out For, which started off as a comic focusing on random lesbian characters and their particular woes and problems and comedic upset that would occur during their life. Over time, she would settle on a set group of characters, and these characters would have adventures and be essentially you get a lot of people getting attached to these particular characters. There's a fun little comic here, although it happened much later on. This occurred in around 2002 and was very relative to the life that was occurring to Alison at the time around 2002, where in San Francisco, gay marriage was temporarily made legal for a month as a result of a technical error, from what I understand. So suddenly there was a huge rush of people within the LGBT scene rushing to get married as quickly as they could. All marriages would unfortunately be made void 6 months later. So Alison herself got married during this time, only to have that marriage voided by the Supreme Court in America. But she caught it all in comic strip form, and she tells stories of her characters very quickly rushing off to City Hall to go get married. So one of Alison's biggest works would be the autobiographical graphic novel called Fun Home. Fun Home basically covered her living in I think it's more the American West for her. I've forgotten. But it would be her coming to terms with herself as a lesbian, but also focusing on her closeted gay father and the life that he would lead. So he was a man that she very much had difficulty understanding, and the way he worked and his relationship with her mother. Basically, the man was also would go about essentially trying to pick up younger men and bring up essentially having relationships with them. The trouble that would cause him, at one point he was basically arrested for selling alcohol to a minor in an attempt to essentially woo that minor into the bedroom. He would be arrested, sort of let go, forced to go into psychiatric counseling. The man would later commit suicide. There's essentially a whole story there. It's a fascinating little read. If you're interested in anything comic book related, I highly recommend Fun Home for just the depictions that occur there. Although apparently if you wait a few years, it is due to be turned into a film. So Alison is probably one of the more famous names in the scene nowadays, with plenty of I believe she didn't get started in The Simpsons at this point. So yeah, very much recommend her works at this point. How are we doing for time? We are halfway through. We're doing good. Okay, so at this point, I want us to, we're floundering around the 1980s here, but I want to take us back 20 years or so to see what was happening in the mainstream comics. At this point, the Comics Code Authority is essentially in full effect. We see the comics that are coming out nowadays are just basically what most people think of when they think of a standard superhero comic. You'll notice in the top right of each of these images is a stamp saying approved by the Comics Code Authority. The system was essentially working from their perspective. The comics were coming in, anything that was considered too problematic was getting stamped out and pushed around. But at the same time, it was pretty much impossible to truly get rid of the LGBT representation that was going on. We would start to see things, and they would happen in various different little ways. Ways that nowadays we considered coded trends. Now, when I first started making this particular presentation, trying to figure out what coded meant, I actually found was a bit of a fluid term. There are various different ways of reading how something is coded. So I'm just going to quickly point out a few of like the ways that I came across along this era. The first off is the ones that are just very damn obvious. These are characters which are depicted as being gay, but the word gay is never really used, or if it is, it's in a sort of push away way. We'll go through a few of the quick characters now. We have Percival Pilkington here. This was a character created by Stan Lee as part of his series Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos. Basically a wartime type, like comic book. Percival, known as Percy, comes across as very much camp and queer in a lot of his actions and the way he dresses and the way he acts and the way he talks. So Stanley would later admit that this character was sort of intended to be gay, but he didn't try to make him look too gay at the time, but it very much shows up. We have the character of Extrano. Extrano refers to himself as Auntie through most of his appearances. He dresses up in a very effeminate way. He talks very effeminately. A lot of the time, he is very much like the relationship handler. You have superheroes who are sort of awkwardly trying to get together. He would be the guy that would come along and make them a couple. He was very much happy to hug everybody, and he is generally accepted as being one of the first earliest examples of a not implicitly gay, not explicitly gay character, but very clearly meant to be gay. We have the Pied Piper introduced. He was a sort of villain / anti-hero character that was introduced in the pages of The Flash. So Pied Piper, pretty much in this scene. This scene occurred in around 1991. To read this scene, it's pretty clear to say he is saying that he is gay there. We have the sharp turn of the Flash's head of oh my God, what is he saying type thing. But at the same time, no direct admission. Again, this is the kind of thing we're dealing with. We also have Arnie Ruff here. Arnie Ruff is probably one of the earliest examples of a proper gay character-focused storyline that occurred in the pages of Captain America. Arnie was Captain America's best friend back in the 1940s before he would be frozen. His personality type would, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, his personality would be essentially mixed in with Bucky Barnes' character as the Winter Soldier. So his storyline of being a childhood friend would be kind of brought into that. So Arnie very much has a storyline where a friend of his has been kidnapped and Captain America has to go rescue him. This friend is a male friend that he's very, very close to. When Captain America helps rescue him, the two of them very much hug in a hospital bed. It's very, very clear what's going on. But again, not actually directly said, although would later be admitted that was the intent. Another type of coded character would be the characters I tend to refer to as the Resonator. These are characters where the creator writing them at the time had probably very little intention for the character to be LGBT, gay, or queer in any particular way. But a lot of readers would look at this character and sort of think, yeah, that's it's a little queer there. I sort of recognize that there. There'll be, in a way, these are my favorite types of characters because there'll be the types of characters where readers would essentially gain a special relationship with the character. They would look at the character and it was that character would particularly speak to them. One of the most prominent examples that have come up in the past few decades is the character of Iceman from the X-Men. Iceman, Bobby Drake, was very different to the original 5 characters that were introduced in the pages of the X-Men. So he would dress a little more flamboyantly, or there would be scenes of him sort of talking to girls as if to say I want to have a romantic relationship with you, but he would never quite get round to it. And a lot of people look at these particular scenes and think, and kind of a lot of to speak to essentially homosexual men on the internet about this, they would essentially say that they looked at Bobby and saw a lot of themselves in what Bobby was doing, sort of putting on a show, a bit, as you will, just talking and talking to women, but not actually going out with them or going out with them to put on a show for their friends in order to make themselves appear to be straight. So Element Man would be another one, although he would start off he was very much a normal non-character within the Legion of Superhero comics in DC. Again, a lot of people saw a lot of the way he acted in the same way as they would Iceman. A fun little example here is in the characters of Riptor and Shatterstar from X-Force. These characters were essentially the hangers-on of the team. It's the team would often go off in paired squads and stuff like that. And Riptor and Shatterstar essentially were the leftovers. They were ones where it's other characters would have relationships with each other, but these two had none, so they were often paired together. And they became very close and would hang out a lot of the time. We know for certain that the creator of these characters, Rob Liefeld, also the creator of Deadpool, had no intent for these two characters to be a homosexual couple. But a lot of people reading these comics would see it this way, and we'll find out what happens to them in a bit on that. Another type is what I consider the hidden between the margins characters. These are characters that were created without any kind of queer traits, without any of like the usual flamboyantness that we may expect like from certain like queer characters. But as they're being created, their creator is literally saying, yes, I intend this character to be gay or in a lesbian relationship and the like. So just quickly go through them here. We have the characters of Taku and Venom from the pages of Black Panther. They would have a very close relationship where Taku would rescue Venom. Venom's a disfigured, like, monster-type character, and they would essentially bond and be very close. We have the characters of Mystique and Destiny here from the pages of the X-Men. These two were villains that, like, joined the Brotherhood, that, like, started the Brotherhood of Mutants in around the 1970s, and this one's one of my favorite relationships because Mystique is a shapeshifter. She has the ability to shift between like different she has the ability to like take the appearance of different characters. And Destiny, when she's first introduced, she's a precog who's 70 years old and is considered a little frail at the time. So, but the creator of these two characters, Chris Claremont, would intend them to be in a lesbian relationship, and you would often see it in the way that they were very close. Mystique was very much older than she looked. Being a shapeshifter, she was able to make herself look like she was around 30 years old, and so she hid the fact that she was the same age as Destiny. So we essentially have two 70-year-old women here in a lesbian relationships in the pages of the X-Men around the 1970s. Never admitted to at the time, but we will find out again what happens to them later. Another small case would, again, in the pages of the X-Men, be the characters of Kitty Pryde, also known as Shadowcat, and Rachel Summers, also known as Phoenix, where Rachel Summers was a character from the far future who got flimmed back in time, and it's revealed that she would have a sort of relationship going on with the older version of a character that she would then meet in the current day, Kitty Pryde. These two, again, it's very much a blink and you can miss it type scenes. There's like essentially a page of them in the future, like where Rachel flashes back and we see her like see her and Kitty using pet names with each other and refer to each other. Again, blink and you miss it. The author has gone out about 10 years ago. He was on a podcast and he just flat out admitted this was always intent. His intent was for these two characters to end up together. He writes a comic called X-Men The End where it shows everybody in their future relationships. Kitty Pryde at that point has become president of the United States and her first lady is Rachel Summers, although again, never directly admitted to within the comic. So we see a lot of interesting trends that were occurring during this time with characters like this. Like Chris Claremont has gone on record saying that if he could do it all over again in the modern day era, he would actually do it in the exact same way. He would have them not admit to being gay. Because to him, it was about the interpretations. He loved the fans reading these comics and coming up to their own conclusions. So he preferred a lot of ambiguity in how relationships worked. And yeah, this is the result of it. Great. So at this point, we're moving on to the 1990s. The 90s is where we start getting a particular group of milestones. Now, you start looking up this stuff on the internet and you start seeing milestones. People love their milestones. First gay character doing this, first lesbian character doing that, first transgender character. And this is where we start to see a lot of it happen. And a lot of what was happening in comics is especially in Marvel and DC, is defined basically by what's happening in New York during this time. DC and Marvel have their offices in New York. So what they see happening there is what dictates a lot of what happens in comics. And what a lot of them were seeing was basically the AIDS epidemic. The AIDS epidemic starting in the 1980s. Unfortunately, was initially linked to gay men. And we can basically see, like, it was seen that like those like gay men with weakened immune systems were being noticed. And comics were starting to take a look at this, and comic book writers wanted to start telling these stories. One of the earliest best examples, again, with the Pied Piper character mentioned earlier, would be in the issue of The Flash, where the Pied Piper hints at just how important the AIDS epidemic is to everybody, not just the gay people who were massively suffering from it at the time, and essentially resulted in a larger spread of homophobia that was occurring at the time. And with this, we actually got one of the biggest stories of them all in the character of Northstar in the issue of Alpha. This is the first explicit gay superhero. So his comic is actually around here somewhere. If people have it's one of them. I don't know where it's gone. It's there somewhere. But yeah, so Northstar, he was originally created in the 1970s as, that's the one, yes. So yeah, everyone's having a quick read of that one. So It's a very clunky story, but it's definitely worth a read for what it is. So basically, North Star was introduced. He was one of those implicitly gay characters that was never fully admitted to. There are early scenes of like him living in his fantastic penthouse suite, and when the phone rings, another man in the swimming pool is the one who picks it up and answers. Very much implied to be his boyfriend, but never admitted to. So North Star would have the dramatic announcement in comics of being the first character to actually say the words "I am gay," to actually admit it. You look this guy up online, and he essentially dominates a lot of the search results to the point where, to read a lot of them, you would almost think this was the first ever reference to a gay character in comic books. Up until this point in time, nothing else existed apparently. There was nothing ever gay before him, but it made research really, really difficult. But his storyline in this basically tells he like after like a usual superhero encounter, he discovers like a baby who was actually dying of AIDS, and it showed like the baby actually dies in his arms, and it brings in a lot of like notice of like a lot of mainstream attention towards this. You see North Star pushing for essentially a lot more acknowledgement of what's going on. He is then attacked by what a character called Major Maple Leaf, who was basically created for the story, but it's essentially the Canadian equivalent of Captain America. North Star is basically a Canadian superhero at this point. So at first it comes across as like Major Maple Leaf being like a homophobe who's attacking North Star because of the result of all this. But it's then like revealed over the course of the comic that Major Maple Leaf had a son who was gay, who died of AIDS. And he's basically just upset of the fact that his son like died and got no notice whatsoever. And if North Star like announced his gaydom sooner, then may have been able to do something about it, maybe were able to bring more attention. The two of them basically fight and have a good old superhero punch-up for a bit, and eventually they would like reconcile and agree to work together to help like do things. It's a pivotal issue to like take note of, but at the same time, it was a little clunky in its in its depictions. And it's not aged fantastically well, but it's still a milestone of sorts. So after this, we would actually start to see a lot more characters coming out. We have the character of Maggie Sawyer. She was introduced in the pages of Batman and Superman as being like the lesbian police chief of Metropolis. We would have the character of Coagula. The Coagula is, if you've seen the Doom Patrol TV series, I believe she's in that. She was the first transgender superhero to appear in comics. If you're familiar with the character of John Constantine, he showed up in the issues of Hailblazer in the Vertigo publications that were happening in the 1990s. A one-off line, basically, like within that storyline, basically showed him to be bisexual. At the time, not really fantastically worked upon, but it's basically there. And we start to see these little cases throughout the 90s of this occurring. It isn't really until the 2000s, I've just realized I've got like 10 minutes left, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Around the 2000s is where we start really seeing the milestones start to hit. So there's a fantastic little story I found with Gail Simone. Gail Simone was the main writer of the Birds of Prey and Batgirl series within DC Comics. So Gail had a moment where, as a child, she always wanted better representation of women in comics, and she was always disappointed. So she thought that when she became a comic book writer, she would always make sure to have plenty of different representations happening. And she wanted to include a transgender character in her storyline, and she was prepared to fight tooth and nail for it. So she got a big list of reasons. She had a meeting with the editor-in-chief at DC Comics, sat him down, and was prepared to do this fight. Only for him to turn around and said, if we want a transgender character, it can't be exploitative. It's got to be a real grounded character, which completely threw her, and she was more than happy with it. And with that, we got the character of Elisa Yu, who was basically Bob Gordon, Batgirl's essentially sidekick character of sorts. She was the best friend for a while. And she would start in those pages and slowly gain more prominence within DC. She's become a superhero in her own right since. And with that, we start to see even more representation. We have the character of Zavin here. This is an interesting example of what was happening in comics at the time when, if you remember earlier on in the presentation, I started saying how we have aliens and shapeshifters and robots with queer characteristics being used to get those traits in. We almost see a flip here of these same alien characters and robots and the like now actually just outwardly being essentially LGBT. So Zavin starts off in the pages of the Runaways, where she shows up as a he. So he as the shapeshifter, he shows up, and it's revealed that in order to maintain a relationship with another character, he transforms himself into a girl. Over time, though, he starts using the girl form as his default form, and essentially, like, the character has been seen as gender fluid. From this point on, she usually sees herself as a she. We got plenty of other ones going on here. Deadpool, a lot of people are familiar with. Deadpool is generally known to be pansexual. He just happily has relationships with anybody and anything. So even in the movies, in the Deadpool movies with Ryan Reynolds has been very much happy to like work on this. Although at the same time, it's still kind of a bit clunky in its depictions. His character usually is shown dating a female woman in those movies. So particular like favoritism here of like the character of Grenpool. Grenpool had a series called Love Unlimited, where she essentially tries to find romance only to discover she is aromatic asexual. And from there on, has been considered like the model of asexuality. So we can see a fantastic situation here where more and more of these characters start to be included. Going into some of what's happening in the past here, we start to see the Comics Code Authority died around like 2011. So it died a quiet death, basically, as time went on, like distributors started to ignore it. Marvel ignored it probably like 20 years prior to. DC would technically had a tenuous relationship with it, but they gave up on it. And as such, the Comics Code Authority essentially died. And in a way, it's a fantastic little era because it was a time when we started to see the coded characters of the past start to become more explicit in their representations. Iceman, although a clunky storyline, was basically he had his mind read by one of his by the telepath Jean Grey, who told him that he was gay. It's an awkward way of telling the storyline, but it is what we got. And Iceman has been able to grow as a gay character since. Mystique and Destiny were finally able to show their relationship to the world and actually be supervillains in love together. Again, we start getting the more fantastical characters. One of my particular favourites here is in Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol, where Monsieur Mallow, the hyper-intelligent ape, and the living brain, a brain in a robot's body, are able to admit their love for each other. They had spent like about 30 years at this point having adventures. They're basically a couple of like homicidal maniacs who get into essentially cause all sorts of trouble for like the Teen Titans and the Justice League, and they realise their feelings for each other, and they've been happily together ever since, killing all of humanity as only they can. So at this point, we start to get the real milestones that people seem to really enjoy. So we have Wonder Woman finally gets to kiss a girl after about 70 years at this point. She is shown here kissing on the character Optimus. We have Richter and Shatterstar, which I mentioned earlier. They get to kiss. Probably one of the first one, which I should probably mention first, would have been Midnighter and Apollo. These are a couple of characters from a comic series called The Authority. They're basically pastiches of Superman and Batman, more kind of serious bloodthirsty versions of them. And they're in a relationship together, they get together. So it was kind of born as a desire of sort of writing Superman and Batman gay fanfic. And yeah, and it was born from that. So they get to be together. So we start getting lots of we actually start getting kissing going on, as well as people actually getting married. So in probably, again, the first example of this is Midnighter Apollo making fantastic first steps here. In 2001, we have the first gay wedding in comics, and we start to see them slowly happen. In 2012, we have Northstar getting married to his longtime love. Whose name? Kyle. Yeah, Kyle Juliet, I believe he's called. They get married. So Mystique and Destiny are retroactively revealed to have been married the entire time. So they have a storyline that goes into a flashback of when they were much, much younger, and they get married secretly on an island. So we have the first transgender wedding in comics with Alyssa Yu, who's the character I was mentioning earlier, who's Batgirl's best friend. She's able to get married. So generally, we have the happiness of getting married going all around. But most importantly, we start getting LGBT characters that have their own comic books. We start seeing them here. Possibly the first one would have been in the pages of Batwoman. Oh, unfortunately, I missed an example a moment ago. Yeah, just to say, it's not all good news, unfortunately, on the getting married front. And around the same time these weddings were happening, we also had in the pages of Batwoman. Batwoman is considered the first character, the first comic with the headline character being a lesbian. And she would essentially, with the character of Maggie Sawyer, she would propose to her. They would essentially date for a while. There was a big plan of getting them together and having a big old wedding. And literally an issue before the wedding was due to take place, editorial intervened and said you can't do this. So the wedding was broken off at the last moment. It's a very bizarre moment in the history of all of this, essentially since at the same time other weddings were beginning to occur and weddings had occurred. Weird step back, unfortunately, it's just the nature of things. So, but at the same time, Batwoman is known for having like the first lesbian character, like headline her own comic book. We start to see a whole bunch of them start showing at this point. Alters shows the first transgender character, like headlining their own comic book. Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy are the two characters which I believe a lot of people are probably familiar with. It's like two women who essentially like get together and they get their own comic book. The Young Avengers is a fantastic little example I like to point out here. So this came out in 2013. The Young Avengers is essentially the teenage version of the Avengers. So it comes out every couple of years and there's a different like roster of characters. This particular roster featured every single character, bar a single one, being LGBT. So America Chavez at the front there is lesbian. The characters of Hulkling and Wicking in the back there are in a relationship together. Speed and Prodigy are both bisexual. Kate Bishop, Hawkeye, who showed up in the Disney Plus series, is the only straight character in the story, and even that is shown to be a little doubtful, as she tends to have a bit of a tendency to stare a little too hard at America Chavez. So we also had Marvel Pride and DC Pride come out around this time that paid homage. So Marvel Pride, to the people in the room, these are the comics going around at the time that have been like shown the short stories of. So one of the good early stories actually referred to Matt Baker, the original artist that I brought up from back in the 1930s. In an acknowledgement to him being a gay creator, they had a LGBT like youth center occur within the pages of Marvel, and the place is named after him. So he gets acknowledged by Marvel to have been one of their earliest gay creators. And this is where we essentially get up to, and it's worth mentioning that the underground itself sort of essentially started to fizzle away in the 2000s due to this wonderful little invention called the internet, where it turns out that you can get your comic and you can put it online and you can like send it over to people and post it to them, but also you can actually put it up online as a webcomic, and people did. And in a way, this is the kind of like possibly the most wonderful age for LGBT like comics, because it basically means like if you have your comic book, no matter how bad an artist you are, how bad a writer you are, you can just get your stuff and throw it up there. You don't even need a website anymore. You've got social media accounts, you've got Reddit, you would just post it all up there. So You Plus Me Dream, or You May Dream, as it may be read, is probably one of the earliest webcomic stories. So involving like a lesbian character who basically falls in love with a woman she's only seeing her dreams and her attempts to find her. Heartstopper is another more famous example of a gay boy, a gay teenager who like comes to realize his own sexuality over time. That's now been made into a Netflix TV series, which is unfortunately to a lot of people just like, you know, things are seen as more genuine if they're TV series or movies and not if they're just comic books. So that's a good thing for a lot of people. For me, in my head, it's like the comic book should be good enough by itself. So we also get like one of the earliest examples is the like special love here for the character of Erin, an asexual character introduced in the like webcomic script Girls with Slingshots. She's a particular favorite of mine. We start to see that this is the future where we are now fortunately living in, where we can act, where we've gone from this past of suppression, of things being hidden, implicit references, everything open to interpretation, over-interpretation. We're now in an era where we don't have to deal with much of that. It's still not perfect. There are still like problems out there. As we saw with the Batwoman comics, like marriage, it's like gay storylines can be cut in just a heartbeat for silly, absolutely ridiculous reasons. But at the same time, there are people out there who said, screw the mainstream, I can just post my own comic online and I'll get plenty of followers and I'll get a TV series out of it. So yeah, and that is where we are up to the current age. Thank you very much for listening. I did not run over. Excellent. So I will open up the floor. Does anybody have any questions that I can somewhat flip my way into answering? Anyone whatsoever? Do we have any in chat? Oh, a question, yes.
I will say, very well done presentation, very interesting. This is just not for the future. What's also about comics outside of the US?
Comics. I really wanted to.
It's a lot of history.
It's a lot of history. It's a lot of wonderful history. So UK comics are unfortunately a little bad for this. So, but it's a different atmosphere in like UK comics. UK comics are sort of like mostly kid related. So so romance and people having like feelings for each other isn't even really shown in any particular way. The best I can say recently is in Beano, we started having a black character, and that's not even in this area of subject. But that's kind of like
recently.
I mean, 15 years maybe. I mean, to me, Beano is like back in the 90s. So, but yeah, it's yeah, yeah. So, but probably the best example would be Judge Dredd in the comics of 2000 AD. Judge Dredd, the main character, has been shown now to have like gay relationships, but it's always dependent on the writer. So some writers will depict him as being gay, some will depict him as being straight, some won't even touch on the subject because Judge Dredd is just a gun-toting like lawman of sorts. So Japan is probably one of the best areas for this kind of stuff. If you're familiar with like this stuff, they've been showing like queer traits easily since the 1970s in a lot of their stuff. So at the same time, you've also had the yaoi and yuri fan scene in Japan, where it's like they've been very happy to have lots of fan comics where they'll depict like gay relationships going on and the like. European comics sort of do well and sort of don't. If you think of like the biggest ones, things like Tintin, Asterix, not the other one, but yeah, other ones like that. A lot of them are very old-timey comics that haven't done anything too new. A lot of them have started introducing characters here and there. I'm not as familiar with them, I'll admit, so I've missed them out. So yeah, it's a mixture of good, it's a mixture of bad, as it was in America. Yeah.
Stevie said this was very informative. I realise I don't know anywhere near as much about comics as I thought I did.
Hey, thank you very much, Stevie. Anything else?
Lots of thumbs up.
I think when I had questions, you kind of answered them by the next slide anyway. It progressed so well through a timeline. But what happened to the blocked comics? Oh no, we don't know because they did a really good job of just like burning them to death.
Yeah, it's the unfortunate thing about it in a lot of cases. I mean, there may have been a storyline where it's like they had a character who they sort of maybe wanted to be gay in the pages of Spider-Man or something like that. We'll never know because it just got rewritten. In all honesty, probably not. A lot of the writers, unfortunately, at the time would have been aware of these mandates and just kind of skirting away from them a little. It wouldn't be until, I mean, that's the thing, like the 1950s, 60s, and coming into the 1970s, that period is basically like just a null zone where just none of this was happening. It wasn't probably until the 1970s where people started to fight against this stuff. And even then, it began to get stamped out. I didn't even get to mention, like, at the start of the 1980s at Marvel, the editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter, started getting complaints from people, like, basically, you can imagine these to be very conservative, traditional people, where it's like, they weren't liking some of what they weren't seeing. And so they were very much like, yeah, we don't want any of this gay stuff in our comics. And it's like, I didn't think there was gay stuff. So, but Jim Shooter still instituted, like, an anti-gay rule to be placed in Marvel Comics, which sort of didn't work because that's where we started to get like the hidden characters that would sneak through, like Disney and Mystique. So Destiny and Mystique. So yeah, it's just the nature of it, unfortunately. It's a lot of awkward history that fortunately we have like actually made great lengths in bypassing now. It's so yeah.
I think when they created the X-Men, they created it with sort of idea of like Black Panther movement and sort of being representative of, but that could be wrong, could be anything. But do you think they saw it like, because now gay people sort of attribute themselves to the X-Men and like,
Yes,
they saw that from the beginning?
Yeah, X-Men is kind of a fantastic. Like, I wouldn't say it was right there at the beginning, at the time when Stan Lee created the X-Men, and just copying Doom Patrol, another comic that was coming out at the time, using those characters. So, and Stan Lee himself, I don't think he initially, to read like the first 10 issues of the original X-Men series, I don't think there was any major intent, but I think it slowly dawned. Really, a lot of like the representation of like smaller minority groups would essentially be picked up upon later, would be more picked upon later on. I'd say it was there to an extent. The Black Panther movement was, I mean, I want to say it was 1970, so we'd be talking 10 years after the creation of the X-Men. So I don't think that's entirely the case, but it was definitely picked up upon. It would have been like, as this was picked up, and again, like the characters like Iceman and the like, people would like jump on these characters. It would definitely be like the new era of the X-Men that occurred in the 1970s that would start to like work on those movements and the like. So yeah. Question?
So this is a very broad question, so it's fine if you don't have a precise answer. But do you think, at the moment, do you think there are more like openly queer villains or more openly queer good guys?
Fantastic question, because especially in like Hollywood and the like, you tend to think of like you would have a lot of queer coded villains. You just have to watch most of the old like pre-90s Disney movies to see queer coded like villains and the like. And yeah, I suppose I look at my examples there. Nowadays, I would almost probably say nowadays it's neck and neck. There weren't actually a fantastic load of examples of queer coded villains that were occurring in comics very early on. So you'd often find most of the examples I brought out were the most prominent examples, and like, I mean, when it comes down to it, I essentially like showed 9 examples total, like pre-1990, and that was the majority of them. So, but nowadays, yeah, I would definitely say it's kind of a healthy mix of the two almost. I mean, often you would find like if you do have like a villain nowadays who is more LGBT focused, those villains would often also tend to start becoming anti-heroes. The Pied Piper Harley Quinn is now usually considered kind of a bit of an anti-hero because she has her own shows and the like. So to the point where it's like probably the only really examples of like pure obvious like gay villains would be Misha Mallow and the Living Brain that I showed there. There's probably other examples like I'll think of them right now. But yeah, I'd say it's a healthy mix of the two nowadays.
The Joker used to be coded.
Yes, I gotta say, I mean, a lot of the early Batman stuff is, again, he very much represents the flamboyant nature of the queer codedness of the like. So, but I mean, a lot of it is always in the hands of the writer. There'll be some writers that would look at it and just use him as being like just like a generic murderer. There'll be some who would like essentially, especially if you think of the Adam West era of the Batman TV series and the like, they would happily make a lot of the characters very queer coded there without hesitation. But yeah, different writers, different eras. But yeah, I'd definitely say like Joker was very much an example of an early queer-coded character.
That's one to follow.
I haven't seen that one. Right, okay then. I think I have gone over time. I'm not sure if I'm getting kicked out at any point, but yeah. Okay then. Thank you all for coming. Yeah.
Can you put that in the meeting chat so that